Or if a centurion had found me having my hair this long, gosh, I would be punished. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today, as you can tell by my attire, we are going to talk about the Romans. So this armor that you see, this is actually my cheap Lorica Segmentata. This is not very high quality, I gotta say, but I'm wearing it today because I'm still waiting for my high quality Lorica Segmentata, which is being produced now for me by Fabbrica Cacti, one of the most amazing and one of the best armorers out there as far as Lorica Segmentata are concerned. So I'm gonna have my proper stuff made soon, I believe. But in the meantime, I got a little nostalgic and I decided to wear my cheap one. So as you can see, today we're going to talk about one of the most popular weapons of the classical times, and that is the gladius. Why do I say it's one of the most popular? Because of course we're talking about the Romans, and as we know, whether it be Republican times, whether it be imperial times, the gladius was definitely the weapon of choice of the legionary. Given, depending on again whether we're talking about early Republic or whether we're talking about after the Marian reforms, we do know that before the Marian reforms, or before actually the creation of the concept of the professional soldier, the professional legionarius, so the one that was, you know, they were all heavy infantry and everyone using a gladius as their primary weapon. Of course, we know that in Republican times you had manipules, and manipules also meant that at a certain point that you had several different sort of kinds of legionaries. You had the velites, you had the hastati, you had the princeps, and etc. Now that is true, but still, even in Republican times, although the word, and this is an interesting point, although the word hasta, and I'm pronouncing the H because I'm using classical pronunciation. I know that in ecclesiastical Latin the H is mute now, like in Italian. I'm Italian, but I am pronouncing the H because I'm using classical. We know that hasta is the spear used by some soldiers in the Roman legions, but please keep in mind that the hastati in Republican times did not have the spear. So basically they were called hastati, but they did not use the hasta. So this can be confusing for obviously, it sort of sounds like a paradox, but the reason for that is actually quite simple. The hastati, the name they had, originates in the Kingdom of Rome, so before the other reforms that you had, because you had many military reforms during Roman times, and so the original hastati were the soldiers using a hasta, but then when we move into one of those reforms, it starts changing things around, and you start having the princeps, you start having the people in the front, the people in the backs, all the rows organized differently. Then the hastati, as a form of combatant, they kept their name, but they didn't keep the weapon. So this is why you have this little paradox there in Roman times. You can check it out, it's quite an interesting concept. Anyways, yes, depending on what period they were talking about, there were kinds of legionaries that were not using as a main weapon the gladius, but the majority, if we look at the Roman history as a whole, the majority of legionaries used the gladius. So the question is, why? I mean, think about it. We have said many times that the most effective weapon and the most common weapon throughout the entire world from a militaristic point of view is the spear. Pole arms are a lot more effective on the battlefield, and yet the Romans seem to go against this trend. I mean, and it's not just a matter of, well, those were classical times, so the spear becomes more popular in the medieval period, in the feudal age, and that's not the case, because and if you look at samurai history, the spear has been constantly the preferred weapons of the samurai, both at least as far as samurai times are concerned. So it's already 1,000 years. And considering, depending on which area of Japan and what time we're talking about, even before that. So, and again, the Greeks, if we consider classical times, used the sarissa as their first weapon and the swords as their backup weapon. So, why did the Romans choose this? And before you bring up the pilum or the pila, yes, they could use in hand-to-hand combat as well. And we know of actual references of battles where the Romans did that. So the legionaries were commanded to use the pila in hand-to-hand combat. But the pilum was mostly a throwing weapon that was used against the enemy to break their morale, to do casualties, and possibly to break shields, so or make shields unusable. So the thing is that if the pilum was not the main weapon, why the gladius? Because we know the spears had a better range advantage, and maces, warhammers, and blunt weapons are good against armor. But here is the key. You see, again, a choice of weapon. The Romans were no fools. They have conquered the known world, so this means that this weapon worked. But there are two elements that we need to take into consideration to answer our question. Element number one, the gladius is not a weapon that they used alone. It's a weapon that was always used in combination with a scutum. It is the combination of scutum and gladius that makes it a formidable weapon. You need to get very close to use it because it's a short sword, but it's very quick. You can conceal it and you can be behind, depending on what stance you use when you fight, and you can only release it and reveal it in the very moment of stabbing, which is a very quick moment, mind you, and difficult to predict. And also you are defended by the shield, so the shield is closing all those areas of your body that might be exposed if you're only using a sword, and so the scutum enhances the effectiveness of the gladius. So the gladius as a weapon on its own, probably not particularly effective, but is a scutum in combination with a gladius exceptionally effective. And of course, again, when we talk Romans, we're talking mostly heavy infantry. But if we talk about cavalry, and in fact when we reach the late Roman Empire, although I'm making a dedicated video on the late Roman Empire, when we reach the late Roman Empire, then the spatha starts becoming more popular, and of course the spatha is a much better weapon to use if you are on horseback than a gladius would be. But the second reason why the gladius was the favorite and chosen weapon of Roman legions is because of the enemies that they were facing. The Romans were fighting against the so-called barbarians. Well, barbarians is a very general term for non-Roman, or at least people who did not have Roman citizenship. But the majority of foes that the Romans had to fight were armies that did not use armor that much. So yes, they would have had their leaders using armor, but for the majority of people, the armies were not equipped with protective gear, exception being possibly some helmets. And that there is an obvious economical background to that. There are a lot of reasons for that. Perhaps I don't have time to go into on this video, but suffice to say that because of the fact that a sword is a fantastic weapon to use against someone who is not armored, that justifies the choice on the battlefield. So yes, you might sacrifice range, effectiveness with the spear, but the scutum is allowing you to get into a very close distance safely in order to use the gladius effectively. So I would like to say, now you could say that sometimes the Romans did have to face enemies that also used a somewhat effective armor, like for example during the Punic Wars, but that is why I'd like to underline the Romans lost a lot of battles during the Punic Wars, and I'm not saying that that's just because of the weapon they were using, obviously not, and I'm not saying that the armies that Hannibal was raising were as well equipped as Roman armies, because the Romans were the best equipped, had the best equipped armies in ancient times. No one could beat the economical machina that the Romans had created to support their soldiers. But still, you know, it is one element that needs to be taken into consideration. But again, Hannibal probably the exception. But for all other cases, the Romans were facing people who did not have armor. Hence, this will become a very effective weapon. But here I say, if the Romans had encountered another massive country, enemy, and they had an incredible economic power, and they knew how to make very good suits of armor for their soldiers, then most likely, I believe, considering the fact that Roman legions, the legiones, were very versatile, and we know that they have changed and adapted constantly, I think that perhaps the gladius would have disappeared before, and probably they would have started using other weapons. I mean, think about it. During the Dacian Wars, the Romans started issuing to their soldiers the manica as a protection for the right hand, because of the sort of weapons that the Dacians were using, which were the famous curved swords that were really good at hitting the legionaries, even sort of bypassing the shield. So as you can see, the Roman legions were really good because they were adapting. So I would say The Gladius was used because it worked, but if it stopped working, considering the fact that the opponent would have started using better armor and more, and armor would have become a more commonly used piece of equipment, piece of kit, then most likely I would say it makes sense to think that the Gladius would have disappeared earlier on, or would have just become a backup weapon like swords were in medieval times, where armor became more common. But of course, let me know what you think, if you agree with my opinion, or if you have other opinions on your own. Of course, I would be very interested to hearing those, so please let me know in the comments below. I wish to thank you for your time, and thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting my channel. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Valete!